Over the past decade, we've seen the multiplayer gaming landscape change dramatically. New genres have emerged, and we've seen new studios rise to prominence with their franchises. Even the pricing model has been disrupted, with a shift more towards in-game purchases, microtransactions for cosmetics or quality of life items. We've also seen a drop-off in popularity for some old favourites, notably 1v1 FPS arena games and RTS games. And of course, we've seen the rise and subsequent decline of StarCraft 2 and the renaissance of Brood War. With all this change that's occurred, there's a lot that new developers can learn from. In this video, I'm going to highlight some of the key design choices that I think Frostgiant Studios need to get right in their development of Stormgate. First is the idea of accessibility, and this comes in a few forms. If you look at the most successful games in recent years, they tend to support a wide variety of platforms, offer multiple game modes, and cater to a wide variety of devices, including low-spec computers. I think a perfect example of this is definitely Fortnite. It's available on mobile, computer, Switch, PlayStation, Xbox. It's not too demanding on your device, but it's graphically distinct, it looks nice, and there's just endless game modes, endless innovation, new maps, new skins. There really is something for everybody within the game. So some of this will be key for Stormgate, and I'm pleased to see that Frostgiant Studios have gone on record to say they're trying to make it the most accessible RTS of all time. Graphically, the game already looks rather stylized, so they're not going for hyper-realism, so I think they will be taking the League of Legends Fortnite approach of nice to look at, but not necessarily massively taxing on the computer. In terms of cross-platform support and potentially mobile, RTS games have historically been very tricky to port to smaller devices, but I think maybe they could take the League of Legends approach, which is to have other game modes or a simplified version of the main game for mobile devices. In terms of offering a variety of gameplay modes to suit all audiences, we already know that there'll be 1v1 PvP, 3v3 PvP, co-op versus AI, and campaign, both solo and cooperative campaign. So already a nice mix, and I definitely think it would be a mistake to heavily emphasize the 1v1 aspect of the game. I think there needs to be a wide variety of credible game modes that are well supported and active. Next up is the important topic of monetization. How will the game generate revenue for Frostgiant? In multiplayer gaming in particular, over the past 10 years, we've seen a shift away from upfront purchases and moving more towards a microtransaction or season pass way of monetizing games. Essentially, these games are free to play and they try to attract as many users as possible, and then they make their money back through small in-game purchases, usually cosmetic or quality of life in nature, trying to stay away from the idea of pay to win. Certainly in PC gaming, we've sort of strayed on the right side of that, but in mobile gaming, I think pay to win is quite rife. League of Legends is a great example of this, in the sense that as a free player, you can do everything in the game, although it may take you a bit longer, may be a bit more inconvenient, and you may lose the flair of having all the different skins and everything, but you can be on a level playing field. All of the various champions within the game have numerous optional skins, and these are normally unlocked by paying some money. And basically, these can range from a simple color palette change to a complete reskin that features different animations, different spell effects, different sounds, and different emotes. Almost all of the skins can be used in professional play. I think that adds to the appeal, seeing professionals using your favorite skins. There's only a small handful which are disabled, and that's generally due to a change of spell effect, which basically makes it harder to see certain effects disguising spells, which is obviously not fair. One notable example is the Eye Blitzcrank skin, which is an iRobot themed skin, and unfortunately his main attack, which is a grappling hook similar to Punch in Dota, with this skin the effect is quite different. It emanates from a different part of the model, and it's very much disguised, and it's just not quite fair. In games like Fortnite and League of Legends, you're obviously playing as one character, so the appeal of having a skin for that one character is quite strong, having different sound effects and things like that. Whereas in RTS games, obviously you're commanding an army of various units, so there's not quite the appeal of one individual skin. Despite this limitation, I do still think with some creativity, there's lots of potential for customization and monetization within Stormgate. And one thing I think StarCraft 2 really got right was the idea of announcer packs. So you could replace the in-game sound effects in terms of voiceovers with other characters from the game, or additional players, or personalities from the scene, such as some of the famous casters. It's quite poignant using these announcer packs nowadays, because some of the people that we knew and loved in the StarCraft scene are no longer with us.
Good luck and have fun.
You're gonna need it.
Insufficient Vespine gas.
GG!
Nuke's ready.
It's time, boys.
Upgrade complete. You're flat broke, mate. Get some more minerals. Your probes are under attack.
We're out of supply. Could use some more depots.
What we know so far is that Stormgate will be free to play, and then I think the wording was additional content will be sort of behind paywalls. And I just hope when they say content, they don't mean actual game modes or maps or anything, and they do mean customization, cosmetics, things like that. Because if you look at League of Legends, every game mode is free to play, but they get you hooked, and then you want to customize your character. So for Stormgate, what I think we need is customization of your army, the way it looks, the way it sounds, announcer packs. Potentially, if they're going to be hero units, there should be customization for those. And there was talk of having sort of perks as like a commander, you know, your army has this benefit or this trait or whatever. And if you are going to be some sort of commander and have a portrait and everything, then there could be customization and things to buy there as well. I certainly remember in StarCraft 2 that I and others were very keen on doing very difficult achievements to unlock portraits. And you don't see the portrait beyond the loading screen, but we wanted to have it. We know that Stormgate intends to have a single player and cooperative campaign. And if you think of the most popular multiplayer games, so CSGO, Fortnite, PUBG, League of Legends, they're all free to play, and they all have minimal or no campaign at all. I think really you need to go all in one direction. You either have to make a AAA quality single player game with lots of voice acting, story, you know, incredible amount of time spent creating a single player campaign, or you create the best multiplayer game you possibly can, work on the engine, work on the gameplay, everything else. Now obviously StarCraft 2 tried to do both. It had a high quality AAA price tag single player campaign and multiplayer included. So you had to buy the whole package in order to play the multiplayer. And yes, it sold well, it was successful because it's Blizzard IP, it's StarCraft, there was huge excitement for the game. But doing that really hastened the death of StarCraft 2 eSports. It was a full 7 years after launch of StarCraft 2 before the franchise became free to play. And in that time, if you wanted to have continued playing multiplayer through the period, you'd have gone down this funnel where you'd have to pay $40 for Wings of Liberty. And then Heart of the Swarm's released, $40 to keep playing multiplayer, because Heart of the Swarm brings new units, but you have to have the new expansion. Then the third expansion, Legacy of the Void, again, requires you to buy that to play the latest version of multiplayer or the latest version of custom maps. Essentially, you're going down this funnel where you're making people pay for every expansion and you're gradually losing players. Now, while there certainly is some buzz around Stormgate, it's not a Blizzard franchise where they can make a reasonable quality game and they know it will sell millions and millions of units. I really think the campaign needs to be basic. It cannot, as a small studio, maybe fewer than 100 people, as opposed to 8,000 people working at Blizzard, they can't spend years and years working on a high quality campaign because it's just not the right direction to go. I really think basic campaign, map editor, campaign editor, scripting. If the community wants to take things further in that direction, they can create their own campaigns. I'm sure there'll be plenty of appetite for that. But I think Frost Giant needs to focus on making the best possible engine, the best gameplay experience, making the most accessible game they possibly can. Another thought which I had is, if you think of the smaller sort of indie single player experiences which have been successful as of late, one of the common themes is having procedurally generated content. So essentially you do less work in terms of creating a campaign, and then the game generates a new experience for the player each time. And maybe, I've not seen that done in RTS, but maybe that is a direction that you could take things to sort of create a campaign that is sizable and time consuming, but not necessarily spending thousands and thousands of hours working on it. So this one will be controversial, but if you think about the trend in multiplayer gaming, the ones that are successful as esports, they're team games. The 1v1 RTS like Warcraft 3, StarCraft has definitely declined. 1v1 FPS such as Quake, basically in decline as well. And what you've seen emerge are Battle Royale games, and the competitive modes tend to be squads, squads of 4 in PUBG, that's the World Championships, or 5v5 Counter-Strike, or 5v5 League of Legends. Everything is team-based. And I think, obviously, the alpha of Stormgate is focusing on 1v1, but I really think the game needs to focus in equal measure on all different game modes, 3v3, for example, and co-op. I really think you need to broaden horizons and, as Frostgiant have been saying, make it accessible to a wide variety of playstyles. 1v1 is only for a small selection of players. Ladder anxiety is definitely a real thing, and certainly in the early days of StarCraft 2 with the interface in the client, it was quite a lonely experience. You were just kind of, there was nobody in the lobby to talk to, the battle.net chat wasn't very good. It was just kind of, you were just in isolation queuing 1v1, and it was quite difficult at times. Whereas people just, people want to play games more casually sometimes. They want to just hop on with a bunch of friends. They're looking to just have a catch up on voice chat, but let's play a game at the same time kind of thing. And with ladder anxiety, when you play a team game, it really diminishes quite a lot because, you can always blame your teammates, or you can always just focus on the social aspect, or, you're in it together kind of thing. I also think in terms of being a spectator sport, when you gravitate towards team settings rather than 1v1, the atmosphere, the excitement, the intensity is just heightened. People react off each other, they interact with each other, they hype each other up. And if you think of 1v1, it can be quite muted at times. It can be quite reserved, especially with South Koreans who dominate, and they tend to not be too demonstrative. Win or lose, they're kind of, even keel. And if you think about StarCraft Brood War, the most exciting, the most epic moments are probably Pro League, where it was the team league. Maybe it was 1v1 games, but they were like all watching their teammates and reacting, and you had epic celebrations and Fireback Hero running into the sea and stuff. I think team games could make it a more successful competitive game. So I think, personally, as a hardcore sort of StarCraft Brood War fan, I would rather 1v1 be the focus. But in terms of what's best for Stormgate and the success of the game and the audience nowadays, which is not a bunch of 35-year-old, 40-year-old StarCraft Brood War fans necessarily, if you want to be successful, it needs to be a team game. The 3v3 needs to be at least as important as the 1v1, and potentially when it comes to organising, series of tournaments and grand finals and stuff, maybe the 3v3 should be the focus. Big tournament. The topic of the competitive scene and also the client and sort of social aspects, I think StarCraft 2 was miles behind its competitors in that regard, in terms of integrating esports into the client and social aspects and events and tournaments and everything else. If you look at a game like League of Legends, though the client is a laggy, buggy piece of shit at times, it's fantastic about keeping you up to date with what's going on, involving you in tournaments, fantasy teams, pick your bracket. There's a match starting in half an hour, you can spectate it, all this kind of thing. StarCraft is sorely lacking in that regard. So what I'd like to see from Stormgate is a dedicated client, which is not just a client when you're playing the game, like launching a match, but a client in between as well, like League of Legends has, and it needs to be integrated. It needs to have streams, you know, from content creators, from tournaments. It needs to allow you to spectate people, like pro matches or just high ladder matches, or spectate your friends. I mean, it took so long to be able to spectate your friends in StarCraft 2. It was ridiculous. You know, in League you can just spectate so easily. It's been happening for like 10 years plus. So just make an integrated experience where you can get involved in the scene and it feels like a living and breathing thing. It's alive, you know? StarCraft was just so dead when you launched it. It was just like this chat room with nothing, nobody in it, nothing happening. You didn't know what was happening in the world. You had to go and watch Day 9 on Twitch to find out what was going on. It needs to be integrated in the client. Obviously, it's not exclusively CrossGiant's job to create hype and buzz around tournaments and things like that, but again, looking at League of Legends, they would create special skins to commemorate a tournament, or like a battle pass for the tournament, so you can watch the tournament and unlock skins and various, you know, collectibles. They really did a good job of creating an event out of each tournament. You know, it was almost sort of reflected in the in-game lore and the design and the characters. And when a team won the World Championships, they were immortalized in commemorative skins for the champions that they played the most or played in the grand finals. Just these small touches, and just creating videos, content, previews, just keeping things going. And I definitely think, like, in terms of the RTS space, that can really be explored quite a lot. I think StarCraft in later years started to get to grips with it, but for a long time it was a real problem. Another thing that I think is important is, in the early days of StarCraft 2, people were constantly referencing the Warcraft 3 tournament system, where there'd be like automatically generated weekly tournaments at the weekends and things. And why is this not in StarCraft 2? From the get-go, Stormgate needs to have built-in tournaments. It needs to be tools, so like groups of friends or small communities, you know, like universities or something, can have their own little tournaments, create their own stuff. And they should have all the best replay tools in terms of, you know, spectating and having overlays and all that, just integrated and not withheld from the community. Just all these touches to make it more inclusive and just easier for people to sort of be involved in the game and keep playing it and create content for themselves. Speaking of the community creating content, map editor and map making tools and the involvement of professional map makers, I think, is really important. You can think back to the early days of StarCraft 2 when we had, no offense, we had like Metalopolis and things, and it was decent, you know, some memorable games, but it was kind of basic. And you had certain maps where there were some really abusable terrain issues, such as that, was it Lost Temple or something, where you could drop a siege tank on a cliff outside the natural, and it was just impossible to deal with for other races. I remember a certain MLG tournament where Idra got absolutely destroyed by that. And when the Kesper map makers became involved, the game just improved dramatically just because of the quality of the maps. I think it's key for Stormgate to have the involvement of professional map makers as soon as possible, and also just to release map making tools to the community on launch. And I really think there should be community map making competitions. There should be a seasonal ladder where the maps are refreshed each season, and the community should have a voice in that. And community created maps should be included if the quality is sufficient, and I think they will be. And I really think that needs to be something that CrossGiant are on top of constantly. And it also helped their job, because you can, when there are certain balance issues or perceived balance issues, you can use map design to sort of nudge things in a direction, you know. I think in StarCraft, you know, if Terran or something is struggling, or I don't know, whatever race is struggling, you create a bunch of maps which favor them. You know, maybe they've got like a pocket expansion that's really easy to defend, and you can wall off your front, and you've got an expansion at the back. You don't get busted so easily. Just things like that. You can just nudge the balance a little bit. You can just, you know, it's just an extra tool to help keep the game fresh, competitive. Like I was touching on a bit earlier, the map making tool should be as fully featured as possible. Like, whatever you're using to make the campaign should basically be what you share with the community, because we're looking for people not just to make maps, but for them to make mods, add-ons, their own campaigns. you should be hoping for the next Dota, the next Counter-Strike, the next Day of Defeat. Like, really, it should be as fully featured as possible and as transparent and open as possible. And if we do get some popular mods and things, don't be weird about it. You know, support it. And I think with the people involved and everything I've been hearing from them so far, things sound good in that regard. Right, finally we're getting into some juicy stuff at the end about gameplay choices, design choices, and these will be quite contentious, I think. Some of them might not be. Obviously there's a lot to learn from StarCraft 2 in terms of what to do and what not to do. Brood War as well. And right, one of the main issues of StarCraft 2 was unit clumping and unit DPS, and battles essentially being over far too quickly and they're far too decisive. So basically one giant battle with 2 death balls that were clumped up, they go bloop and they kill each other in 5 seconds, and whoever wins that battle wins the game. Now, it wasn't all by intentional design, but in part due to dodgy pathing, which caused units to gradually get spread out like spaghetti as they moved around. StarCraft Brood War battles were much more spread out and resolved much more slowly, so units didn't do quite as much DPS. Armies were spread out over several screens, and battles, you know, mini battles within big battles, it was all very spread out and epic and back and forth, and there was comeback ability in the game, and it was just better, you know. It was just more interesting, and it was far less often the case that somebody lost a fight and they just got busted and, you know, the army's on top of this production and it's game over kind of thing. It was much more like, that was a big strategic defeat, they're going to have to go away and lick their wounds and change their strategy, but the game's not over kind of thing. So in Stormgate, I think what we need is looking at how long fights are taking and adjusting HP and DPS accordingly, and maybe just don't have buttons that like select the entire army, or don't allow infinite control groups, or don't allow the idea of units clumping in one spot. For example, a Viking flower in StarCraft 2, that was just stupid, you know, like 25 Vikings stacked on top of each other. If you want to do that in Brood War with Mutalist Micro, at least it was a skill that was involved. It took hundreds of APM, you know. People were better at it than others. Just click on one spot, you make a Viking flower in StarCraft 2. It's like, well, that's stupid, you know. And I can't really suggest anything particularly smart myself, but a real focus needs to be on thinking of ways to encourage armies to be split up in different locations. Because too often in StarCraft 2, it was just the entire army in one place fighting the entire army in the same place. There was no strategy or other locations and other resources. It was all just one big battle, and it almost didn't make sense to split your army up because you make yourself vulnerable, you know? And it's going to take map design, game design. I'm not quite sure how it's going to be achieved, but it needs to be achieved. We can't just have death balls slamming into each other. One thing I know for sure is that rush distances and map sizes, and is it a 2-player map, is it a 3-player rotational symmetry map, is it a 4-player map, that needs to matter. And that didn't matter for a long time in StarCraft 2 because of Protoss, pylons, and warping mechanics. It basically just negated all map design. You know, rush distance, screw that, there's a pylon next to your base, I can be there straight away. And it needs to not be like that. Like, distances need to be significant, they need to matter. You know, there needs to be travel time. And yeah, I'm sure a lot of the mistakes made with Protoss will not be made in Stormgate. I think another key design philosophy needs to be the idea of making multiple approaches and multiple units viable, as opposed to sort of chasing the meta, where you can only make a certain type of unit and a certain composition. And, you know, think of Terran, you know, the bare minimum is that you should want to have mech and bio as being viable, 2 different approaches. You know, if things are great, even like some sort of air Terran with battle cruisers and stuff, you know. And I think it's really important to have that diversity in builds and make things viable and constantly tweak the balance. Not big changes, but just constant incremental changes to keep things in line and keep things interesting, fresh. I think one thing we can all agree on, and Blizzard definitely learned as well, is units that spawn infinite trash units as a kind of siege mechanic just result in absolutely garbo games, like truly awful matches. So Swarmos, the flying version, the ground version, just one hour sieging up a Terran who's making ravens and trying to shoot down the projectiles. And also Infesta with Infested Terran. I think they got rid of that as well more recently. And I think all that kind of stuff just needs to stay in the history books. And also, speaking of siege mechanics, I think the Tempest was a little bit over the top. It just resulted in really not very exciting dynamics. It was just kind of, you couldn't really have any back and forth with it. Either you're getting pounded by it or you kill them all and the game swings kind of thing. There's no sort of in between. I think another thing to consider is, well, two things, I guess. There was a survey by Frost Giant asking about unit progression in terms of the idea of veteran units and leveling up and things. They expressed not wanting to become like a MMO, leveling up a character kind of thing. I think Warcraft 3 did it well with the heroes and putting items on them and they level up. I think that was good. I think it encouraged skirmishing and not giant deathball battles. Like, it encouraged sort of cat and mouse and back and forth kind of play. I think it was good. What I think needs to be avoided is the idea of normal units leveling up and becoming like, imagine you've got like a siege tank up on a cliff and that's like your defense. And every time it gets some kills, it gets XP or it levels up and becomes a veteran siege tank and it hits harder, fires further. Think of Civilization or something. That will just encourage like people not to do attacks and turtling and just silly stuff. So I really do think the Warcraft 3 way is the best way. In terms of upgrading units, the sort of direct way, like researching Stim, for example, Stim pack, I think it needs to be a bit more deliberate in design in terms of so many of the upgrades were just no-brainer. Like you make the unit, so you make the upgrade. It's just always the way. You make Marines, you make Stim pack, you make Combat Shield, and I think they need to be more active decisions with upgrades. Now, an active decision would be getting Cloak on a Banshee or getting Speed on a Banshee, things like that. And I think the more you can move towards active decisions like that and less sort of required upgrades where you just have to have them to make the unit function, like, Siege Mode being a research item in Brood War, I think that needs to be avoided as much as possible. And I think a final point, which is probably going to reveal me as a Protoss hater, is the idea of sort of asymmetrical micro mechanics. When there's a battle, both players should be focusing on the battle and be required to do stuff to control their army. And in StarCraft 2, there were certain scenarios where that balance was so skewed, where like one person could just leave their army to do its thing and not touch it, and it would do well. The other person was constantly on the edge of disaster. They made one misstep, the whole army goes splat kind of thing. And the ones where it can't be punished was the worst. So you think about Terran versus Zerg and you're running away from Banelings and you're trying to spread your units out from the Banelings to mitigate, the splash damage. The Banelings are squishy. They can be focus fired and they die really quickly. And if you don't micro them properly as Zerg, you might just run your Banelings into like a building or a Thor or something and they'll be wasted. So on both sides, there was danger, there was micro, it was constantly, it was in flux, the outcome wasn't predetermined. I think a Protoss with Charge Zealots with armor upgrades, right, against Terran. You're Terran and you get a bunch of Charge Zealots running at you and you're playing Bio, right? You just have to micro your arse off. You just have to run back, stutter step, micro, and the Zealots just charge through by themselves. And I think it's even a mistake to try and micro Charge Zealots in StarCraft 2. Only in Brood War do you micro a Zealot. And it's so one-sided in terms of the Protoss can just AFK and the Zealots will do a good job. The best job, in fact. And they don't get punished because they're so tanky and they have smart AI and they just go for people, not for buildings. And it's like, that's the kind of thing that needs to be avoided. And the Banelings versus Marines scenario is what should be encouraged, where there's genuine threat and required micro on both sides. So obviously there's a lot we don't know about Stormgate at this stage, but some of the early signals have been quite positive in terms of the decisions that Frost Giant are making, in terms of sort of being free to play, for example, and trying to make the game accessible and have multiple game modes and everything like that. But there's still a lot we need to find out, and I do hope that they make the right decisions to make this game a success, because I know there's lots of people that are really hoping it will be. I hope you enjoyed the video, and just thank you for sticking with it. I'd be interested to know what you guys think about some of these topics, so I'll be keeping an eye on the comments. I'm just showing the subscription button here on the screen now, and the plan is to be consistent. Try to put out a video maybe once a week, and quite often I'll be talking about Stormgate, RTS, competitive gaming, multiplayer gaming. So if that kind of stuff is interesting to you, then I really would appreciate a sub, and yeah, I'll see you soon.